Today we're going to make a modern sofa out of some plywood. I put a fresh Diablo blade specially designed for cutting plywood onto my 18-volt circular saw. This combination works really well for cutting plywood. The frame for the sofa is made out of 2.5 sheets of 3/4 inch thick plywood. I clamped down a straight edge and then used my circular saw to rip the plywood into strips. I will post drawings with measurements on my website. I used my speed square and circular saw to cut the plywood strips to length. I started the assembly process by gluing these strips of plywood into beams. I used a brush to spread the glue evenly and then clamp the pieces together. I let the glue fully cure before removing the clamps and starting to assemble the next beam. I cut some 1 foot by 30 inch pieces of plywood which are going to serve as the top of the 2 side tables that are built into either side of the sofa. I used some long clamps to hold pieces of the frame in place while I glued and screwed the layers together. Now I was just kind of figuring out this design on the fly, so I just was grabbing random pieces to sort of infill in the panels. But I've since revised the drawings, and when I post it on my website you'll see a more efficient design. I raised everything up onto blocks so that I could get underneath the pieces of the frame and glue and clamp them all securely together. While the glue on the frame was curing, I started to glue together pieces of 3-inch wide plywood strips that are going to serve as the 2 legs for the sofa. I used my orbital sander to sand the edges of the frame flush. I flipped the frame upside down and then started to attach the legs. I did this about 2 to 3 layers of plywood at a time, gluing and screwing between the layers. After securing the first 3 layers of the legs in place, I glued and screwed some spacers and a beam that's going to go underneath the seat and backrest of the sofa. This beam is just made out of 2 layers of the 3-inch wide plywood strips. What's cool about this design is that you can make this sofa as high or as low as you want simply by adding more strips of plywood to the legs. I used my circular saw to rip a thin strip of plywood at a 45-degree angle. This is going to serve to fill in the gap between the seat board and the frame. I glued this filler piece flush to the front of the frame. I sanded down the angle of the filler piece so that the seat board would fit in nice and tight. I screwed the seat board in place and then test fit the back piece. I marked the angle of the back piece on a 3-inch wide strip of plywood and then cut a triangular shape out of it. After cutting a bunch more triangles the same size, I glued these pieces together to make supports for the backrest. I made these supports 5 and 6 layers thick and then sanded down all the edges with my orbital sander. I sanded the seat board flush to the front of the frame. I then placed the backrest and then glued and screwed the triangular supports to the backrest. I didn't screw the triangular supports to the frame because I want to be able to take the backrest out so that the whole thing will be easier to move. I finished the plywood with 2 coats of Minwax polyacrylic. I ordered some pieces of foam online. I'll put a link to where I got them in the description box below. I get all my leather and leatherworking tools from a place called Tandy Leather. They have a really great website, and if you do make it into one of the stores, the staff there is very knowledgeable. Now, Jesse and I don't have a lot of experience working with leather, so we just tried to figure out what would be the easiest way for us to make a cover for these foam cushions. But here's the super easy way we did it. We just punched some holes along the piece of leather. Fletcher was visiting at this time, so he came over for a quick inspection. We then pounded in some brass grommets to reinforce the holes. We then used some string to lace up the cover like a giant leather burrito. This was a really easy way to cover a piece of foam, and it actually looked way better than I thought it would. The sofa is incredibly comfortable, and because the frame comes apart, it's really easy to move even in the tightest stairwells. For more detailed instructions, including dimension drawings, be sure to check out my website. And if you want to see what I'm working on next, follow me on Instagram. That's where I post project updates and generally share what I'm working on next. If you're working on some of your own DIY projects, consider posting them on Ryobi Nation. Ryobi Nation is a really awesome website. It's where I get a lot of my design ideas, and anyone can go on there, sign up, and post their own projects. We also have other videos that show different designs for DIY sofas. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already.